Martha Gellhorn, you've had a writing career, novels, short stories, journalism, that's lasted 60 years. And in the last decade and more, your fiction and much of your reporting has been reissued. You've seen horrors in Spain, in China, Dachau, in Vietnam. And you've written much about wars. What was the hardest subject, do you think, that you had to write about?
I mean, in war, what was the worst one saw, hardest to write about? They weren't hard to write, because they were just reporting. You just wrote what you saw, what you heard. That wasn't very difficult. But I think the worst, to me, the worst of everything was Dachau. The concentration camp was much worse than anything I'd ever seen in war.
Why was that?
Because it was organized reduction of human beings to skeletal shapes. It was planned and repeated and steady cruelty. It was like torture, and this is an abomination, the worst abomination of man, just torture on a large scale. And then, of course, when I got there, they were all still there, the prisoners. And there were the piles of the dead, which were these naked yellow skeletons, just piled like wood, outside of the place where they burnt them. And the living were going around, they had typhus, and they were just sort of staggering around with faces that had seen too much, had gone through too much.
Are there horrors that it's impossible to describe?
Yes, I don't think I ever got that entirely across as it was, because it's also your own shock makes you perhaps less observant than you ought to be.
Very early in your writing career, you wrote, in 1931, you wrote an account of a lynching. You hitched a lift, and the men who offered you and your companion the lift said, did you mind if they detoured because they were on their way to a lynching? You buried that, as it were, and then a couple of years later managed to write about it. How did you recover that episode in your mind to write about?
Well, it's really a very odd story. I was staying at H.G. Wells's house, because one of the usual occupations of the young was to sponge, and I was sponging, you know, free board and lodging there, and he used to give me lectures, very irritating lectures, about the fact that if I didn't go to a polytechnic and study science, I would never be able to write. And also, if I didn't get up every day and start writing as he did at 9:30 and write until 1, nothing would come of it. And in fact, I was headed for uselessness, generally. And I was not about to get up at that hour. Well, I had to. He forced me. I had to get up. Then I would go back to bed, because I spent the evenings dancing with young gentlemen of my acquaintance. And one day, I just sat...
All dressed up, dancing?
Oh, yes, all dressed up.
Uh-huh.
And, yes. And then he forced me. I had to get up, have breakfast with him, which was torture. And then one day, just to show off, I sat in his garden and just wrote that, just to show him I could do it. And then he took it off and sold it, which he had no right to do, because in point of fact, it was what Truman Capote would call faction, in that I had been picked up on that road, but we were coming from it, not to it. And the details of it were reported by them to me. And then I met a black man whose son had been lynched, and he told me more. And so I was in fact doing a combination of things, of reporting and putting it in. And I only did it to show off to Wells, because I just wrote it like that in an hour and a half or something. And then this miserable man who knew that went off and sold it to the Spectator.
You see, it's extraordinarily interesting to hear that from you, because the way the piece is written poses all sorts of questions about your role as an observer of the scene. Could you have tried to stop it? What did you say to the people after they did it? But in fact, the whole of it had happened before they came to you.
The whole of it had happened, and they were boasting about it. Yeah. And we did say things like, how did you know? How did you know? And they said, well, since when don't you take a white woman's word against a nigger? Yeah. And we said, but that doesn't sound good enough to us. And then things like, well, shut up, Sonny, and shut up, lady, you know. So, and as one was dependent on these characters, also rather frightened. So, but then I found this man whose son had been, and he told me in detail, and I really oughtn't to put that in. It is faction. It's the only one that
the only one that's faction.
Only one that's faction. I oughtn't to put it in, but I do put it in because I'm sure that it's right, and that at the time when it was Wells who sold it and it got published, and I wrote to Mrs. Roosevelt with terrible anxiety about this, and said now it's gone out as journalism, and it was in fact stuff I heard but did not see, and I told her about it, and she said, oh, don't worry about it. I don't think the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is going to complain.
I bet they wouldn't.
And
yeah.
So it was useful, but it was, and I keep using it because in a terrible way I like it.
It's a marvelous piece. If none of the rest of the journalism is faction, how much of the fiction is faction?
No, the fiction is, the thing about the fiction is that I have to be sound on place. I have to know where something's happening, the land or the streets or the scene, and that's always right. But then the fiction is made up, and it has been said to me that as it seems to be so real, that it looks as if I was just reporting stuff that I'd seen and then put it into a story. But it isn't, it is made up.
What's the function of the reporter? Is it to record what he or she hears and sees, or is it to incite feeling in the reader?
Well, I think possibly both, because I think that if one does any good, or it has any purpose at all, which is, you know, you can discuss it at length. I'm not at all sure about that. But then it is keeping the record that some place or other there is something on the record that would be at least a question against something else, the rewriting of history. And so that's one thing. So you try to see as much as you can and have it as convincing as possible, because you want it to be seen, felt, heard by others. And then the other thing is that it depends on what you see and what you like and what you're interested in. But of course, mine generally are, I hope that people will see it and feel it and understand it as I did. And then that, in principle, will make them angry.
What's more important to a reporter, eyes or ears?
Both. Both. You can't...
What do you do about language if ears are important?
Well, I get on in lots of ways. I get sort of kitchen handling of various languages. And then, for instance, in Vietnam, I got students who spoke French, who understood French, and they'd come around and translate for me. And in Poland, I found people who spoke either French or English or German. You pick up things like that.
What fascinates you about war reporting? Or about war?
Well, it doesn't fascinate me. The reason I started in Spain was because I was in Germany when that war broke out. And there it stood in the German papers that the red swine dogs of Spain have attacked. So I knew exactly who was the right side. There wasn't any problem about that. And then I went because it was the only place that fascism was being fought. But I didn't intend to be a reporter. I mean, I just intended to go and see what I could do, act of solidarity with the right people. And it was entirely accidental. I didn't write anything for quite some time. It was entirely accidental that I became a war reporter. And then war was what we had. That was what our history was. But during this time, I also wrote...
You had to go and seek it out. I mean, it was there for the finding, but you busied yourself to get there on many occasions, didn't
Yes,
you?
but it was, for instance, Czechoslovakia, there was no war. And yet that was the most terrifying and terrible story. I was there before the Munich and after Munich. And I went around France and Germany before the war, these civilian stories about how people were feeling about the oncoming war. And then when there was war, the next one, when I went to China, I wanted to see the Orient. And as I was by now Collier's war reporter, the way to get there was the Sino-Japanese War. And that was an extraordinary business. I didn't actually see any war because the Japanese at that point, we were going to the Canton Front near Hong Kong. And at that point, the Japanese had withdrawn. They used to just surge in and go as far as they wanted, and then they'd have to go back because their supply lines. So you just hear a little bit grumbling noise in the mountains. But it was a hardship journey to beat everything.
Victoria Glendenning said of you that you had a need to cover wars. Do you? Did you?
Well, World War II was the necessary war. Necessary because everybody mismanaged it to the point where it became necessary to have it and to win it. And of course it mattered to me intensely because we would otherwise all be living in the 1,000-year Reich, which is to say dead. And so yes, I wanted desperately to see everything that's happening that. And then afterwards, and then Vietnam, I went out of rage, out of fury at the kind of reporting that was coming out as if bombs were accurate, as if, you know, you could drop bombs and you found immediately a Viet Cong instead of finding the entire civilian population, which I was sure they were doing. And that was, first place, I wanted to see what was really happening because you weren't getting any proper reporting. And also then furious indignation about that. That's the war I took personally. I felt personally responsible.
As an American?
As an American.
You went to Panama in 1990. What persuaded you to go there?
Well, again, the U.S. had done something outrageous. And I'm a sort of reverse patriot. When the U.S. does something outrageous, I feel I have to go and see about it. And
Do you still have a U.S. passport?
Yep.
Right.
I still have.
You vote in elections there?
Yes, oh yes,
right.
Definitely. Well, I was in Belize, as a matter of fact, and then I heard about this ominous and seemed to be perfectly idiotic thing. And then I thought, well, I really must go and see what they've done. And of course, it was infinitely worse, again, than had been reported. And I just felt it had to someplace put it on the record.
Now, at the risk of being ungallant, you were born in 1908.
That's right.
So when you went to Panama to report this war, or this incident of war, you were 82 years old.
Yep.
Were the other journalists surprised to see you?
There weren't any. I don't know what the Americans did in the actual event, the actual invasion of Panama. The invasion was over when I got there. It's just the after effects. And there were...
Because that's significant, isn't it? It's important to report the after effects.
Oh, absolutely.
It's the effects as much as the action.
Oh, yes, the action was scandalous, but the after effects were absolutely devastating and inexcusable, and of course, as usual, the people who got it in the neck were the poor. And there wasn't anybody around. I never seemed to run into journalists except a little bit in the Second World War.
Where were you born?
St. Louis, Missouri.
Who was your father?
My father was a doctor, and a wonderful and extraordinary man.
In what way was he wonderful and extraordinary?
Well, he was a highly educated man, and he believed in excellence, and he also was, he thought that, I think he thought, without ever saying it, that medicine was a vocation, and more than half of his work was charity work. He died from exhaustion very young, and he was a model of probity and intelligence and independence. He didn't accept anybody's opinion just because it was the going opinion.
Who was your mother?
And my mother was a wonder. She was born in St. Louis, and she started out, I can't remember what the first thing was. I think it was something to do with pure milk. But then she moved on and she became a suffragette, got votes for women, and then the League of Women Voters. But she was a civic, she took it as if that city was sort of something, a garden that she cultivated. And she was very beautiful and very funny and very charming. And she managed to lure people. She was kind of Pied Piper of luring people into being good and doing work that they would otherwise not have done. She was not a model.
A model for you?
Oh no, she was much too good. My father used to say, why can't you be more like your mother? And the answer was, I couldn't.
Are you a feminist?
I don't suppose so. I always thought that once the vote had been gotten for us, and we could have our own passports and our own bank accounts, and we had, therefore, legal freedom, it was kind of up to us. But that's a silly personal point of view. I don't like any of the stridency of feminism, but I feel very, very strongly about disadvantaging of women, which is really hasn't much to do with I don't know if that should be called feminism. It's something to do with equality.
It sometimes seems to me that men or women who've had strong, powerful mothers don't feel quite the same way about feminism as other people do, because they think, I've had that example from my youth.
Well, and also I was never handicapped. I mean, I was brought up with 3 brothers, and the general idea was that I could do anything they could do, I could do as well. And I had no hampering at all, ever, because of being female. So that in my own experience, I didn't suffer from any disadvantages from being a woman. And that's a very, so then you don't understand when you haven't yourself gone through it.
Have you found in your work an advantage in being a woman?
Yes, I think so.
In what way?
Well, I was sort of a roving joke, you know, in the wars. I had never had any papers in the Second World War. I was just on my own because I had the magazine I worked for, you had only one combat correspondent. The job was taken, so I was relegated to second place. So I just went off and kind of thumbed my way around the war. And as I never had anything to do with the upper ranks, I just fetched up with the soldiery. And I think they, I don't know, they seemed to just think it was amiable.
Good to see you around.
Amiable, you know.
What sort of education did your parents give you?
Well, I went to the proper girls' school in St. Louis, where my mother had gone before me. And then we finally reached biology and anatomy. And I brought home the textbook thinking, who better to hear my lesson than my father? And he discovered that the human form was like the Amazon, the undiscovered reaches of the Amazon, which was to say sort of from the ribs to the thighs, it was white. There's nothing there. And this put him in such an absolute fury of rage that he took me around to school the next day and told the principal that he was not going to allow his daughter to go to a school of such utter and absolute imbecility, and I was removed. And then there wasn't any school to go to, a serious problem. So my mother got busy with other people and they made a school, the first coeducational country day school in St. Louis. I went to that for a couple of years. And then I went to Bryn Mawr, where my mother had been. And I left it after 3 years out of boredom.
When did you first think that you might want to write?
Oh, I think I was always a tremendous letter writer. I think, seriously, probably when I was about 15 or 16.
After Bryn Mawr, you went to Paris?
I first I had a job on the New Republic in New York, and then I had a job on the Hearst paper in Albany, which was wonderful. I covered the morgue and ladies' clubs and minor streetcar accidents.
What did covering the morgue involve?
Just going and sitting there and asking the man who ran it whether anything interesting had come in.
Did you have a look?
Yes, I had a look. I've been eaten with curiosity all my life, so anything that I could find out about anything I've been interested in. And then I went to Paris with the idea that I would instantly become a foreign correspondent. That didn't work out quite like that.
How did you become a foreign correspondent?
Well, I wrote bits and pieces. I had odd jobs. I kept getting fired from jobs because I was no good at them. I had a job for a little bit on the UPI, and I had a job on Vogue for a little bit, and then I wrote some articles and sold them to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and lived on practically nothing. And I suppose I was just sort of freelancing around until, and then I wrote some books in between. I went back to America and I wrote some books.
You've been lucky in your editors.
The Collier's editor was wonderful, Charles Colball. He was the one who just, because for years, I don't know how long was it, 37 to 46, 9. I could just go where I wanted and stay as long as I wanted and write what I wanted.
At what length you wanted?
No, I don't think so. I think there was a clamp down on length. I don't remember what it was, but I think it was probably 2,000, 2,500 something.
But I mean, magazine length of that sort suits your writing much better than does newspaper length or newspaper deadlines, is that right?
Oh yes, I couldn't have done that at all. Couldn't possibly. I mean, I have only pity and admiration for those who had to rush around saying, have you taken Hill 232? No, we've lost Hill 232. No, wasn't of any interest to me.
Did you have a method as a reporter? I mean,
No.
You seem to just arrive and sort of meet people one after the other.
Yes, that's all. Just arrive and look. But as I wasn't in a hurry, I could always stay long enough to have a pretty good idea of what was going on and who they were, what they were thinking and doing. That's all, just show up and say hello and hope for the best.
Did you ever take notes?
Very seldom, on the grounds that I'd remember anything that was really worth remembering.
Did you?
Yeah.
So your memory filtered out the
Filtered
stuff
out,
you weren't
yes.
going to write about. Yeah. Is it hard for a woman to be a reporter of war and such?
No. You mean, how? How do you mean hard?
Well, is it harder to get where you want to get than it would be for a man?
Not until World War II, when the Americans moved in, and the American public relations officers, none of whom had ever heard a shot fired in anger, and most of whom came from Hollywood, had wonderful ideas about what women should and could do. And so therefore I just left. I'd gotten to Normandy, to D-Day, D+1, by getting onto a hospital ship. Because if you said, I just want to go on, I'm just interviewing the nurses, it's just the woman's angle, then nobody paid any attention to you. That was of such utter unimportance. And so I just locked myself in a loo, and then when I came back from that, they realized that I had done what I could not do. And it was very severe reprimand, and if you do anything more, it's disobedient, you're accreditation will be taken away, you'll be deported to the US, etc., etc. And they sent me off to someplace in Essex with a lot of nurses wearing tin hats in Essex and preparing to go over much later. And so then I just rolled under the barbed wire and went to an airfield and got a ride to Italy.
In action or near it, were you afraid?
Whenever there was reason to be, yes. I don't have an imagination in advance.
What's the connection between your life and the fiction that you write? What role does the writing of fiction play in your life?
Oh, huge. Well, in the first place, it's so much harder. It is the hardest. And that in itself was you know, every time you finished a book, you weren't pleased with the book, but the fact that you'd finished it made me feel I'd gone up the Matterhorn backwards. It was a wonderful sense of something done. And then I've used it as therapy in the sense of you want to forget something, all you have to do is write it. And also to amuse myself in sort of bad and dull patches of my life, then write a funny book. And mainly I think it's just that it was the most interesting thing there was to do.
So, suggesting that you write to forget something suggests that the subject matter is your own experience.
Yes, well, for instance, I wrote a war novel, and I invented an American battalion. I knew nothing about American battalions. I'd never been with Americans because I couldn't, because of the American PR officers. And I invented some battles and everything else, and I invented a man, a soldier. And I had this soldier go to Dachau. And the soldier had, his reactions and his seeing Dachau just took it away from me, which I wanted to do.
If it's harder to write fiction, are you prouder of the fiction than of the journalism?
I'm really not terribly proud of either. I mean, the best I could do, and that's it. Right.
What have been the happiest days of your life?
Oh, that's hard to say. It's spread. It's here, there, and everywhere. I love to snorkel, so I have wonderful memories of places of great orgies of snorkeling. And I used to like to go on walking trips, and that was tremendous fun. In a general way, I would say that there's as much happiness as not, just in being alive.
And the worst years?
The worst years were during the Vietnam War. Without question or doubt, the worst years, because I went in '66, and I could never get back. I think I was the only person who was banned because they didn't have censorship. But I was 2 years early, after 1968. And the Tet Offensive, you could say that it was a ghastly and criminal and outrageous, but I did it in '66. And that really irritated the Vietnamese and the Americans. And so I never could get back. And therefore I spent that whole war with a complete writer's block. It didn't seem any point to do anything at all except end that war. And so I just bounced around like a Mexican jumping bean, just traveling all around doing I don't know what. And helpless, because the only thing I know how to do that's of any use is write. I couldn't write. So that's definitely the worst years, from '66 until it ended.
Your
75.
mother died in 1970.
Yes.
Was that was a lot? You'd been very close.
Yes.
Though apart.
Yes.
Did you keep very closely in touch with her? Did you write much to her?
Oh yes. Wrote to her at great length, except when one was at a war and couldn't. But otherwise, yes, I wrote to her all the time. And I saw her. We did wonderful jaunts together. We went off and had fun together. And she died, but she was very old, and I was glad for her. It was time.
One of your books is called Travels with Myself and Another. Are you happier with another, or happier alone?
Happier alone, traveling. I practically never have traveled with anybody else. I like it. You don't have, you know, this nervous thing of, you feel that you must find out, are they going to like it or not? And then you want to do something, then they don't. Then you have a huge discussion. Then you have a compromise, doing something that neither of you wants to do. And I don't get lonely, so I much prefer going off by myself.
Have you been happier married or single?
Oh, single. Definitely. Definitely.
You adopted a son.
Yes,
Where is he?
here in London. And a very nice chap.
Is he your sole family, or does he have family?
No, he has none. I have 2 brothers.
Right. What put you on the side of the underdog in your writings? In 1934, you saw the effect of the Depression in the United States when Harry Hopkins hired you to report on what was going on. Did that leave a lasting mark on you?
Yes, but I already had the sense of haves and have-nots. And the have-nots seemed to me always to be both the more interesting and the more deserving. And that was from Paris, because in Paris there was the unemployment, and there was strikes, and there was general suffering and whatnot, and I was always involved in all of that. So that going to America, I in fact hadn't realized that the Depression had hit America. I thought it was only in Europe. And it was when I suddenly realized it was there that I decided to go back and see if I could be of any use.
You met both Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes.
Did you admire them?
Yes, Mrs. Roosevelt, extravagantly. Next to my mother, the most I admire anybody.
What did you admire about her?
She was like the true north. She never morally or emotionally went wrong. She always, it was a kind of, yes, like a true north. You could take your bearings on her. And I think that she was one of the reasons it was a great presidency, because I think she kept him also, even by nagging, which she didn't like. And he could charm the birds off the trees. He was an absolutely delightful, charming man, and skillful. And I think what made him probably more human was his polio, that having himself suffered so terribly, he did understand more about suffering than most politicians who don't seem to have much contact with real life the minute they become politicians.
Did you admire his America, or the Roosevelt's America? I mean, you were very critical of the United States. What about those years?
That was the time I did like it, and it was the time I liked Americans too, because I thought all these poor, suffering people who'd never known what it was like to be dependent, without work, and had this thrust upon them and lost all of their confidence and hope and everything. And I thought they were extraordinary and wonderful, and I liked everything then. I liked him, I liked his government, I liked the country. It was my favorite moment. And then I liked Americans again in the Second World War. I liked the Citizens' Army whenever I saw it. But I have never liked any other regime as much as Roosevelt's.
Britain? You live in Britain. Do you
Yep.
like Britain?
Oh yes. I don't like its politics at the present moment, but I love the country. And I just lately, because of this wonderful weather, I've just decided how much I love London. If it keeps on like this, it'll be, you know, when we'll decide this is the most wonderful place in the world. I like the Brits too.
Does journalism change anything?
Well, that I'm not sure. I think if there wasn't any, then we would be in darkness. You have to have somebody reporting something. We wouldn't know. You can have, if you're in a police state where all the reporting is censored and all one-sided, those people are blind, really. And I don't know that it changes, but I think without it, it would be darkness. How would we learn? How would we know? We can't all be everywhere.
You say that it's curiosity that informs your journalism. Are you still curious?
Oh, you bet. All the time. Curious about this very moment. Curious all the time, yes.
What's your next assignment?
Well, I'm trying to write a piece about South Africa, and I'm not getting anywhere with it.
Have you been there?
Yep, I spent the winter there. And I'd never been before, because I didn't wish to set foot in it as long as it had apartheid. And I went there with the idea that I would swim and lie in the sun and sort of look at a few things. You can't swim, it's crashing waves and icy cold. The weather is was very unreliable. And so I instead spent my time operating as if I were a journalist on assignment, just looking at everything I possibly could. And I am fascinated by it. And I came back filled with hope also, which is very unusual. And of course I've come back with a total loving reverence for Nelson Mandela, who I think is he and Gandhi are probably going to be the two great men of this century.
Do you think he's going to succeed?
I don't know, they haven't any money. If there was any money, yes, but they bankrupted themselves. Apartheid was frightfully expensive. And all it needs is money. I mean, they just need 6 million houses and God knows how many schools and hospitals. And if there isn't any money, I don't know. But I have a very strong feeling that the country, that almost everybody in the country is behind him. But now whether they'll like to pay taxes and whether they'll like to make any sacrifices to make this work, that I don't know.
What advice would you give to someone embarking on writing or journalistic writing today? What's the first thing that someone who wants to write journalism should remember?
I have no idea. I have the faintest idea at all. I think what you want to do is learn how to write. That's the most important. Just learn how to write. Just teach yourself how to write. And then just go forth. And
how do you teach yourself to write?
That also I don't know. I think just by writing. You just write and write and write, and it either...
Do you rewrite?
I cut a lot, mainly. No, I don't much rewrite, but I cut. I peel and pare, and you know, you see your writing. You teach yourself. You see what's ridiculous and what's absurd and what's no good, and we really don't need 15 adjectives, that kind of thing. And anybody can teach them. If you are meant to be a writer, you can teach yourself to write. But not everybody. Everybody thinks they can because they can talk. So they think if they can talk, they can write. That's a tremendous error. But considering the number of books that are written by people who can't write, I don't know, perhaps everybody can write.
Next week, Jeremy Isaacs comes face-to-face with a man of many talents, not least of which is writing. Norman Mailer is in the chair next Monday, 11:15 on BBC Two.